This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, strap in, everyone, because today we're going deep on Midway. Yeah, the epic carrier battle, the big turning point in the Pacific. But I think it's way more interesting than just that one clash.
Oh, absolutely.
What if I told you this whole turning point, it really came down to, secrets and gambles and just plain luck?
You hit the nail on the head. We picture Midway as this huge clash of ships, but the real story, it starts way before the fleets even see each other.
Yeah, exactly. We're talking spies and codebreakers working in the shadows. That's what set the whole thing up back in June of '42.
6 months after Pearl Harbor. Think about it. Japan is on a roll. They're unstoppable, just taking over the Pacific.
Right.
Their goal was to crush the U.S. Pacific Fleet, totally knock America out of the fight. And they picked this tiny little atoll.
Midway.
You'd think, why Midway? But it was key to their whole plan.
A tiny island, huge implications.
That's where Admiral Yamamoto comes in, the guy behind Pearl Harbor. Brilliant, but he comes up with this massive plan, a three-pronged attack, to lure the U.S. fleet into a trap and just wipe them out.
Yamamoto, always bold. But this time he was assuming a lot about the American fleet. Assumptions that,
Yeah, they'd come back to bite him. He thought the U.S. was still reeling from Pearl Harbor, demoralized, weak. He figured their fleet was all over the place, not ready for a fight.
But what he didn't know
was the U.S. had this secret weapon, a bunch of code breakers, down in a basement in Hawaii, Station Ipo.
While the Japanese are planning this huge attack.
These guys are racing against time, trying to crack the Japanese naval code, JN-25.
Can you imagine the pressure, the fate of the whole Pacific, maybe the whole war, resting on these guys?
It was weeks, months of just grinding away.
Yeah.
And then, boom, breakthrough. They start picking up bits and pieces of Japanese messages, whispers about a big operation. Code name AF.
They had a name, but what did AF even mean? How'd they figure that out?
They pulled a trick, a real smart one, sent out a fake message, supposedly from Midway.
What, like a distress call?
Not quite. They complained about a water shortage.
A water shortage.
Pure bluff. But it worked. Soon enough, Japanese messages are talking about AF having water problems.
So they knew it was Midway. That's amazing, like a spy movie.
Right. This tiny detail, a fake water shortage, changed everything.
Oh.
Now the U.S. knew the Japanese were coming. And roughly when.
But they didn't know everything, right?
No, not at all. They still didn't have Yamamoto's full plan, how many ships he had, the specifics. Big gaps in their intel.
Okay, so that's where Admiral Nimitz comes in, right? The U.S. Pacific Fleet commander. He's got to make a choice.
A huge choice. Play it safe, hold back, and maybe lose Midway. Or gamble everything on this limited intel and try to ambush the Japanese.
Tough call. I mean, this wasn't just about one island. It was about stopping Japan, turning the whole tide of the war in the Pacific.
Exactly. Huge stakes riding on Nimitz's decision.
So last time we left Nimitz with this impossible choice, right? Play it safe or go all in. They knew the Japanese were going for Midway, but taking them head on, that's a whole other thing.
And remember, Nimitz was working with scraps, really.
Yeah.
The Pacific Fleet was still hurting after Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
He had 3 carriers, that's it. Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, which was barely patched up from Coral Sea.
It's like David and Goliath, right? Nimitz had to be smart, use every trick he had.
Exactly. And his biggest advantage, surprise. The Japanese thought they had the upper hand, had no clue the U.S. was reading their mail, predicting their moves.
Talk about a shock.
So Nimitz takes the gamble. He sends the carriers to this spot northeast of Midway, a trap.
Wow.
It all came down to timing, a little bit of luck. The Japanese carriers get close to Midway, their planes launch, first wave hits the island.
Okay, so far so good for them.
Right. But here's where it gets interesting. See, the Japanese, they split their forces,
right.
Yamamoto's plan. You've got the main carrier group, Admiral Nagumo's in charge, north of Midway, waiting to pounce.
On what they thought was a weak U.S. fleet.
Exactly. Then there's this other group bombarding Midway, getting it ready for invasion.
So, the trap is set. Japanese are feeling good. Their planes are all over Midway. Nagumo's just waiting to strike.
But they don't see those American carriers, just over the horizon.
Hold on, didn't the Japanese have scout planes? How'd they miss that?
That's the million-dollar question. They had these slow planes, launched from cruisers and battleships, not the best for scouting. They missed the American carriers completely.
Oh, man.
So Nagumo's blindsided. He gets his report, American ship spotted, But he doesn't know how many, where they are exactly. Talk about pressure.
He's got to make a decision fast with no good information.
And that decision, it was going to make or break the whole battle. Now, Nagumo, he was all about following Japanese doctrine, right? He was fixated on this second wave, hitting Midway Island again, take out the defenses, then worry about the ships.
So he's got planes ready to go, loaded with bombs for Midway. Then he gets this report about the American ships.
And he hesitates. He knows he's got to react, but he doesn't want to abandon the original plan.
Yeah.
So he tells his crews, rearm the planes, swap the bombs for torpedoes, anti-ship weapons.
But switching weapons on a carrier, that's got to take time, right?
Yeah. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of guys scrambling on a crowded deck, bombs coming off, torpedoes going on, fuel lines, chaos. All while the carrier's bobbing up and down with the waves.
And meanwhile, those American planes are getting closer.
Exactly. What Nagumo didn't realize, those weren't just any planes. These were Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers built to sink ships.
The Dauntless, tough little bird, right? Could take a beating. And the pilots. They knew their stuff, diving almost straight down, dropping bombs right on target.
And this is where those U.S. pre-war drills, the fleet problems, they paid off. They practiced this exact thing, surprise attacks with dive bombers on enemy carriers.
So the Japanese are rearranging the furniture, and the Americans are about to knock down the whole house.
It's that clash of tactics, technology, everything comes down to this. This moment was going to decide Midway, maybe the whole war in the Pacific.
So we left off with the Japanese carriers. Total chaos, right? I mean, try to picture it. You're on the deck of one of these things, planes everywhere, bombs, fuel lines, the whole ship's rocking back and forth. And then, out of nowhere, American dive bombers show up.
It was like their worst nightmare come true. All those careful plans, the whole Japanese idea of being this unstoppable naval force, it just fell apart.
Yeah.
Those American dive bombers, the Dauntlesses, they just tore into those carriers.
I can't even imagine those planes screaming down, bombs exploding, the decks on fire, smoke everywhere.
It was brutal. 3 Japanese carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, and the Soryu, went up in flames, done for. Their main strike force gone in a single attack.
What a turnaround. But the Japanese weren't totally finished, right? They still had one carrier, the Hiryu.
Right, the Hiryu.
Yeah.
Her commander, he saw what happened to the others, so he launches this desperate counterattack.
Makes sense. Gotta try something.
Yeah, and his dive bombers actually found the Yorktown. Hit her with a bunch of bombs, did some real damage.
So, even when they were losing, the Japanese pilots fought back hard. This wasn't just a walk in the park for the Americans.
You got it. Battles, they're never that simple. Both sides had their heroes, their losses. But the tide had turned. The U.S. had 2 carriers still fighting, and they weren't letting up.
So they went after the Hiryu?
Yep, sent those Dauntless dive bombers right back out.
They were the stars in the show, huh?
They did their job. The Hiryu put up a good fight, but she was outnumbered. She went down too. A total victory for the Americans. 4 Japanese carriers sunk. Just like that, the pride of their fleet, gone.
What a change in just a few hours. Midway wasn't just about sinking those ships, though, was it? It was like Japan lost this aura of invincibility. The whole balance of power shifted in the Pacific.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That was the end of Japan's big offensive. From then on, it was the U.S. pushing back.
We've talked about the code breaking, the strategies, the tech, the guts it took to fight that battle. But if we take a step back, what's the big lesson of Midway? What can we learn from it all these years later?
I think the biggest thing is how important good intel is. Knowing what your enemy's going to do, seeing the whole picture, that's what won it for the Americans.
Those code breakers back in Hawaii, they were the real MVPs, huh?
No doubt about it. But just knowing stuff isn't enough. You got to be able to use that intel, make tough calls, take risks.
That's where Nimitz shined, right? He trusted the code breakers, his commanders, his men. He went with a risky plan, and it paid off big time.
On the other side, you see what happens when you make bad assumptions. When you stick to a plan even when things change.
Yamamoto was so sure the Americans were weak that they'd walk right into his trap. That was his downfall.
Midway shows us even the best plans can fail. You got to be able to adapt, think on your feet, especially in a fight.
It's a reminder that people make history. Those big decisions, good and bad, they're what changed the world.
Absolutely. And it's a story that still matters today, right? It shows us why intelligence is so important, what it takes to win, the courage, the sacrifice.
Well, that's our deep dive into Midway, folks. Hope you learned something new, saw just how complex this battle was, and why it still matters today.
And hey, history's full of these stories, just waiting to be discovered. So keep asking questions, keep digging deeper. There's always more to learn.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.